The late afternoon sun baked the suburban streets of Kansas City, shimmering off car hoods and storefront windows. Officer Joshua Calhoun adjusted his sunglasses as he leaned back in his patrol car, scanning the neighborhood for any sign of trouble. His partner had called in sick, but Joshua didn't mind working solo from time to time. He had built a reputation on his sharp instincts, his ability to read people with uncanny accuracy. Dispatch crackled over the radio. There had been a petty theft just a few blocks away. The clerk at a convenience store reporting a stolen bottle of liquor. The suspect? A tall black male in his 40s, wearing dark clothing. Joshua perked up, clicking the acknowledge button on the receiver. Though the theft itself wasn't serious, he understood the importance of maintaining control. Small crimes left unchecked could snowball into larger issues. Catching someone red-handed, even for stealing a bottle, was an opportunity to make it clear that actions had consequences. He glanced down the sidewalk, his eyes zeroing in on a tall black man dressed in a charcoal blazer and slacks, strolling at an even pace with a briefcase held loosely at his side. Joshua didn't need much more to set his plan of action in motion. "Fits the description," he muttered to himself, his voice barely rising above the distant hum of the city. The streetlights flickered ominously, casting shadows that danced menacingly on the pavement. With a deep breath that seemed to draw on the weight of the night, he stepped out of his car, the door creaking like a ghost lament. His heart raced, thundering in his chest like a drum heralding an approaching storm. Each footfall felt heavier than the last as he moved toward his target, the cool night air wrapping around him like a shroud. His hand instinctively brushed against the edge of the cuffs on his belt, a reassuring gesture that stirred a sense of purpose within him, a silent promise that he was prepared for whatever lay ahead. As he drew closer, the figure before him blurred in and out of focus, the shadows obscuring the truth, and an electric tension hung in the air, thick and palpable. He could almost taste the anticipation, a metallic tang on his tongue that mingled with the adrenaline coursing through his veins. This was no ordinary night. This was a moment where fear met resolve, where the line between right and wrong blurred beneath the harsh glare of the neon lights. "Excuse me, sir," Joshua called out with authority, making his presence known before the man made it another 10 feet. The man, calm and composed, with precise gray streaks lacing his short black hair, turned to face him, eyebrows raised in faint curiosity. He offered a polite smile. "Good afternoon, officer. Can I help you with something?" Joshua noted the smoothness in his tone, but dismissed it. Guilt could wear many masks. "I need to ask you a few questions. Where are you coming from?" The man frowned slightly, tilting his head like he was trying to solve a riddle. "From my office downtown. I'm heading home now." "And what's in the briefcase?" Joshua asked brusquely. The man blinked but didn't waver. "Just legal documents. I'm a federal prosecutor." Joshua barely registered the words. He was already mentally connecting the dots, forcing the facts to fit the conclusion he'd drawn. Tall? Check. Black? Check. Mid-40s? That seemed about right. The alleged thief might have changed out of street clothes into something more professional to avoid suspicion. Criminals were cunning like that. "I'm going to need you to put the briefcase down and turn around," Joshua said, moving closer now. For a fleeting moment, the air between them thickened, heavy with tension as the man stood frozen, his clear, dark eyes piercing through the chaos of the night, studying Joshua with an intensity that spoke of disbelief and confusion. The world around them seemed to fade into a hushed silence, as if the very stars had paused in their celestial dance to witness this pivotal encounter. Then, breaking the stillness, he spoke, his voice a calm yet unwavering tide amidst a storm. "Officer," he began, each word measured, laden with the weight of indignation, "I'm not resisting. You need to understand that I think you're making a grave mistake. I don't fit whatever shadowy description you're working with." His gaze didn't waver, challenging the very foundation of the accusation, and in that moment, it was as if he was not just pleading for his own truth, but standing up for something far greater. a fight against the invisible chains of misunderstanding and prejudice that threatened to ensnare him in a world quick to judge. Joshua's hand tightened on his handcuffs. He'd heard this kind of spiel before. Everyone claimed innocence. "Sir, you match the description of a suspect in a theft incident nearby. I'm going to need you to cooperate." The man let out a measured sigh, his fingers remaining loosely curled around the handle of the briefcase. "Respectfully, that description you're relying on, a tall black man in his 40s, is incredibly vague. It could apply to hundreds of people in this city. And I just told you I'm a federal prosecutor, not a thief. At least verify my story before escalating this." Joshua stiffened. The man's calmness somehow grated on him, like he was trying to take control of the situation. If he were innocent, wouldn't he be more panicked? More defensive? "This isn't up for debate," Joshua said curtly. In a swift motion, he turned the man around and secured the handcuffs around his wrists. "You can explain yourself down at the station." The man remained silent, his jaw tight, his shoulders square. He allowed Joshua to guide him into the patrol car, but before ducking inside, he spoke quietly. "Mark my words, officer," he said, his voice dripping with a mixture of sorrow and foreboding, a subtle tremor beneath the calm facade. "You're going to regret this, and not because I wish it upon you, but because you're on the precipice of a harsh awakening. In a moment, you will find yourself entangled in a web of consequences you never anticipated. This is not merely a choice you've made today. It is the beginning of a lesson that will haunt you like a shadow, gnawing at your conscience as the days slip into nights. The weight of your decision will settle heavily upon your shoulders, and you will come to understand the true meaning of remorse. So, take a good look around, officer, because this moment is a calm before a storm you've unwittingly invited into your life." Joshua brushed off the comment, shutting the door firmly before sliding into the driver's seat. The courtroom was unusually quiet the next morning, the air heavy with a sense of anticipation. The case was rushed forward due to the man's insistence on addressing the matter without delay. When Joshua arrived in full uniform, he felt a flicker of unease. Something about the way the defendant carried himself, poised and collected, despite the humiliation of sitting in the defendant's seat, was unsettling. Judge Marion Foster presided over the small hearing, her sharp eyes flicking from the prosecutor to the defendant. "Officer Calhoun, you apprehended Mr. Donald Avery on suspicion of theft," the judge began, her even tone hiding none of her curiosity. "I understand the suspect matched the description provided by a witness." "Correct." Joshua straightened. "Correct, Your Honor. The witness described a tall black male in his 40s. Mr. Avery fit that description." The judge's gaze shifted to the defendant. "Mr. Avery, you indicated you had evidence to disprove these claims. Please proceed." Donald Avery, now free of the handcuffs that had bound him for hours, stood with quiet assurance. He smoothed the front of his blazer, his movements deliberate and unhurried, before addressing the court. "Your Honor, I am, as I informed Officer Calhoun, a federal prosecutor who has worked extensively in this very courthouse for over 15 years. At the time of the alleged theft, I was meeting with colleagues downtown. I have multiple witnesses and time-stamped security footage from my office building to corroborate my whereabouts. Additionally, the briefcase Officer Calhoun so zealously questioned contained nothing more than case files, as it always does." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle over the room. Joshua felt heat creeping up his neck. He didn't dare glance at the gallery, where spectators leaned forward in their seats. Donald continued, his voice calm, but gaining an undeniable edge. "But beyond proving my innocence, which I could admittedly do in my sleep, there's a deeper issue at play here. Officer Calhoun arrested me based on an exceedingly vague description. Tall, black, male, 40s. That could describe any number of individuals walking through the city." Joshua bristled but remained silent. "I don't doubt Officer Calhoun believed he was doing his job," Donald went on, pacing lightly now as he addressed the room. "But when vague descriptors like these are used to target people of color, It exposes a dangerous pattern, one where individuals are not seen as people but as potential threats solely because of their skin tone. This kind of implicit bias isn't just harmful, it undermines the very foundation of justice we claim to uphold. Judge Foster's expression grew thoughtful as Donald continued. Had I not been a federal prosecutor, this case might have played out very differently. My credentials afforded me the ability to defend myself today, but what about those who don't have that privilege? What about those who are arrested on equally flimsy grounds and left with lasting marks on their records? True justice requires accountability and self-reflection, not just from officers, but from the institutions that enable these behaviors. He finally turned to Joshua, his gaze piercing yet devoid of malice. Officer Calhoun, I don't doubt your intentions, but intentions are not shields against harm. Either we begin challenging these biases head-on, or we continue perpetuating systems that treat people like me as suspects by default. When Donald sat down, the silence in the courtroom was deafening. Joshua's throat felt dry, his palm damp as Judge Foster leaned forward. Officer Calhoun, she said, her tone steely, I believe Mr. Avery has raised an important point. Your actions, while perhaps well-meaning, were reckless and lacked the necessary due diligence. As such, I am ordering you to attend implicit bias training and issue a formal apology to Mr. Avery. Joshua swallowed hard, but he nodded. Understood, Your Honor. Judge Foster turned to Donald. Mr. Avery, I thank you for your professionalism and for using this platform to address a critical issue. Court is adjourned. Later, in the corridor outside the courtroom, Joshua hesitated before approaching Donald. The prosecutor stood chatting with a colleague, but he noticed Joshua and excused himself. Mr. Avery, Joshua began, his voice lower than usual. I want to apologize for the arrest, for not listening. I realize now that I should have handled things differently. Donald studied him for a long moment before offering a small nod. Acknowledging the problem is the first step, officer. The second step? Doing the hard work to change. Joshua nodded, words failing him. As Donald walked away, a feeling settled deep in Joshua's chest. Not quite guilt, but the sting of enlightenment. It wasn't enough to keep the peace. He'd have to learn what justice really meant.